Germany designed the world's first ballistic missile that could strike cities from hundreds of miles away. But the engineers who built it would become the architects of space exploration for nations that had fought to destroy them. The V-2 rocket killed thousands in London and Antwerp. 20 years later, its successor would carry men to the moon. Before we go deeper into how these men shaped the future of two superpowers locked in a Cold War arms race, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. On May 2, 1945, Wernher von Braun walked into an American checkpoint in the Bavarian Alps with his brother Magnus and a small group of rocket engineers. They had spent weeks fleeing west from the collapsing Reich, carrying blueprints and technical documents hidden in mine shafts and caves. Behind them, Soviet forces swept through Peenemünde and the industrial heart of Germany's rocket program. Von Braun had made his choice. He would surrender to the Americans, not the Russians. It was a decision that would determine not just his fate, but the trajectory of humanity's reach into space. The engineers who built Hitler's Vergeltungswaffe weapons represented the most advanced rocket science on Earth. From 1937 onward, they had labored at the Peenemünde Army Research Center on Germany's Baltic coast, developing liquid fuel rockets that could fly faster and farther than anything previously imagined. The V-2 rocket stood 46 feet tall, weighed 14 tons fully fueled, and could carry a 1-ton warhead across 200 miles of sky. It broke the sound barrier. It reached the edge of space. It struck without warning, descending at over 3,000 miles per hour. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched more than 3,000 V-2s at London, Antwerp, and other Allied targets, killing an estimated 9,000 people. But the true cost of the V-2 program extended far beyond its military casualties. Production had been moved underground after Allied bombing raids destroyed Peenemünde in August 1943. Deep inside the Harz Mountains, at a facility called Mittelwerk, concentration camp prisoners assembled the rockets in tunnels carved from solid rock. The camp was called Mittelbau Dora. More than 60,000 prisoners passed through its gates. At least 20,000 died there. They died from exhaustion, from malnutrition, from beatings by SS guards. They died from tunnel collapses and from being hanged as examples. More people died building the V-2 than died from its use as a weapon. The engineers knew. They walked through those tunnels. They inspected the assembly lines. Arthur Rudolph served as production director at Mittelwerk. He saw prisoners hanged from overhead cranes. He authorized their deployment to construction sites where conditions were even worse. Wernher von Braun visited Mittelwerk. He held the rank of Sturmbannführer in the SS. He selected skilled prisoners from Buchenwald to serve as forced laborers. Years later, von Braun would claim he was apolitical, that he joined the Nazi Party reluctantly, that his only passion was space exploration. The documents tell a different story, but in May 1945, none of this mattered to the Allied powers racing to claim Germany's technological secrets. The Americans, British, and Soviets understood what Germany had accomplished. The V-2 represented a revolution in military capability. Jet engines, guided missiles, rocket propulsion, high-altitude research, these technologies would define the next generation of warfare. More importantly, they would determine which nation dominated the skies above the battlefield. Within weeks of Germany's surrender, all three Allied powers launched operations to seize German scientists, engineers, equipment, and technical documents before their rivals could claim them. The British moved first. Operation Backfire assembled German rocket personnel in October 1945 to demonstrate V-2 launches for British, American, and Soviet observers. The tests took place at Cuxhaven on Germany's North Sea coast. German engineers, many still wearing Wehrmacht uniforms, prepared and fired 3 V-2 rockets while Allied officers watched and took notes. About 38 German rocket scientists traveled to Britain for further consultation. But Britain lacked the resources to sustain a large-scale rocket program in its war-exhausted economy. Most of the German specialists returned to the continent within months. The Americans pursued a different strategy. In July 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized Operation Overcast, later renamed Operation Paperclip. The program's objective was straightforward: bring German scientists to America before the Soviets could capture them. The operation began modestly. The first group of 7 rocket scientists, including Wernher von Braun, arrived at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor in September 1945. But the program rapidly expanded. By late 1945, 3 large groups of German rocket specialists had been relocated to Fort Bliss, Texas, adjacent to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. In total, Operation Paperclip would bring more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. The American military shipped over 300 railcars of V-2 components from Germany to White Sands. German engineers, working alongside American Army personnel, began assembling and testing the captured rockets. Between April 1946 and September 1952, 67 V-2s were launched from White Sands. The tests served multiple purposes. They trained American engineers in rocket technology. They tested high-altitude scientific instruments. They pushed the boundaries of what was known about the upper atmosphere. And they kept the German rocket team occupied and productive while the United States decided what to do with them. Living conditions at Fort Bliss were austere. The German specialists and their families lived in barracks. They could not leave the base without military escorts. Technically, they were prisoners of war being employed under contract, but they were valuable prisoners. In 1950, the Army transferred the von Braun team from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Their mission: develop ballistic missiles for the United States Army. The German engineers would remain at Huntsville for the next 2 decades, eventually forming the core of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. The Soviet operation unfolded differently. When Soviet forces reached Peenemünde and the industrial sites of Thuringia in May 1945, they found that the top German rocket scientists had fled west, but thousands of lower-level engineers, technicians, and skilled workers remained. The Soviets initially allowed these specialists to continue their work, reconstructing facilities and gathering equipment. Then, on the night of October 22, 1946, Soviet military units executed Operation Ossowiakim. More than 2,500 German specialists and their families were rounded up and transported to the Soviet Union. They were given 2 hours to pack. Resistance was not an option. The deportation was comprehensive and carefully planned. The Soviets took not just rocket engineers, but specialists in aircraft design, electronics, optics, chemistry, and metallurgy. Entire families, wives, children, elderly parents, were loaded onto trains bound for the Soviet interior. They traveled for days across war-ravaged Eastern Europe into Russia. Most arrived at facilities near Moscow, where they were assigned to various research institutes working on missile development. The leading rocket engineers, including Helmut Gröttrup, who had been Wernher von Braun's deputy at Peenemünde, were sent to NII-88, the Soviets' primary rocket research facility in Podlipki, northeast of Moscow. For the first 2 years, the German specialists proved invaluable. They helped the Soviets understand V-2 technology. They assisted in producing the R-1 rocket, essentially a Soviet-built copy of the V-2, which first flew in October 1947. 13 German engineers participated in those initial tests. But Soviet leadership had no intention of building their space program on German expertise. By mid-1948, most German rocket specialists were relocated again, this time to Gorodomlya Island on Lake Seliger, 200 miles northwest of Moscow. The island became a gilded cage. On Gorodomlya, more than 170 German scientists and engineers, along with their families, lived in relative comfort but complete isolation. They had houses, schools for their children, adequate food, luxuries in post-war Soviet society. They could not leave. Soviet guards patrolled the perimeter. Any trips to the mainland required permits and escorts. The Germans continued their work, developing advanced rocket designs and solving theoretical problems. But they were increasingly sidelined. Young Soviet engineers were sent to the island for training, learning from the Germans before replacing them. By 1950, Soviet rocket designers like Sergei Korolev had absorbed what they needed. The German contribution had served its purpose. Between 1950 and 1958, the Soviet Union gradually repatriated the German specialists. Most returned to East Germany, where they were forbidden from discussing their work in the Soviet Union. A few went to West Germany. Helmut Gröttrup settled in West Germany and went on to invent the smart card in 1967, but he never worked on rockets again. Unlike their American counterparts, the German engineers who went east did not become the architects of a space program. They were teachers whose students surpassed them. The Americans faced a different problem. Operation Paperclip had been authorized with specific restrictions. President Truman issued a directive stating that no ardent Nazis or active participants in Nazi atrocities should be admitted to the United States. But the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, systematically violated this directive. Officials rewrote personnel files, minimizing or erasing Nazi Party affiliations and SS memberships. These sanitized files were then attached to security clearance applications with paperclips, hence the operation's name. When investigators later reviewed the original German personnel records, they found extensive evidence of Nazi involvement that had been deliberately concealed. Werner von Braun's case was emblematic. His dossier showed he had joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940, eventually rising to the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major. He had visited Mittelwerk multiple times and personally requested concentration camp labor for rocket production. None of this appeared in his American security file. Instead, he was presented as an apolitical scientist whose sole interest was space exploration. The deception worked. Von Braun became an American citizen in 1955. He appeared on television with Walt Disney, promoting space travel to millions of Americans. He became the face of America's space program. But not all the paperclip scientists escaped scrutiny. Arthur Rudolph, who had directed production at Mittelwerk and later managed the Saturn V rocket program for NASA, came under investigation in the early 1980s. The Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations uncovered evidence of his direct involvement in the slave labor system. Faced with prosecution for war crimes, Rudolph agreed to renounce his American citizenship and leave the United States in 1984. He returned to West Germany, where he died in 1996, still protesting his innocence. Kurt Debus, another former SS member who became the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center, faced less severe consequences. His Nazi past was known but overlooked. He had been present at Peenemünde and had witnessed the use of forced labor. After the war, he supervised rocket testing at White Sands and later oversaw construction of the launch facilities at Cape Canaveral. He retired from NASA in 1974 with full honors. The engineers' contributions to American space exploration were undeniable. Von Braun and his team developed the Redstone rocket that launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, in January 1958. They built the Saturn family of rockets that powered the Apollo program. The Saturn V, designed under von Braun's direction at Marshall Space Flight Center, remains the most powerful rocket ever successfully flown. It stood 363 feet tall and generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust. 13 Saturn V rockets launched between 1967 and 1973. Not one failed. 6 of them carried astronauts to the surface of the Moon. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 lifted off from Cape Canaveral atop a Saturn V. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. Wernher von Braun watched from Mission Control. The rocket that carried them was a direct descendant of the V-2, scaled up and refined through 2 decades of development. The engineers who had built Hitler's terror weapon had fulfilled their dream of space exploration, but under a different flag and for a different purpose. The Soviet Union followed a parallel path without the Germans. Sergei Korolev, drawing on what his engineers had learned from the captured German specialists, developed the R-7 rocket. In October 1957, an R-7 launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. In April 1961, another R-7 carried Yuri Gagarin on humanity's first spaceflight. The Soviets achieved these milestones using indigenous technology, though the foundation had been laid by German V-2 expertise acquired through Operation Osoaviachim. The fate of Hitler's engineers reflected the pragmatic calculations of the Cold War. Both superpowers prioritized technological advantage over justice. The same men who had built weapons using slave labor became celebrated rocket scientists. Their pasts were sanitized, their crimes overlooked or excused. Von Braun received the National Medal of Science. Debus had a crater on the Moon named after him. The engineers themselves rarely expressed remorse. When questioned about Mittelwerk, von Braun claimed he had been powerless to change conditions. Rudolph maintained he had simply followed orders. These explanations satisfied few of the survivors, but they satisfied the governments that employed them. By the 1970s, most of the original German rocket engineers had retired. Von Braun left NASA in 1972 and died of cancer in 1977. Debus retired in 1974. The generation that had lived through 2 world wars and helped launch the space age gradually passed. What remained was a complicated legacy. Their technical achievements were extraordinary. The rockets they designed opened space to human exploration, but those achievements were built on a foundation of suffering, exploitation, and moral compromise. The engineers themselves never resolved this contradiction. They saw themselves as scientists pursuing knowledge, as dreamers reaching for the stars. They preferred not to discuss the tunnels, the prisoners, the bodies. When confronted, they deflected responsibility onto the Nazi regime, onto the SS, onto anyone but themselves. History has struggled to balance their contributions against their complicity. What happened to Hitler's engineers after World War II was neither purely redemption nor purely justice. It was something more ambiguous and uncomfortable. It was pragmatism. It was the recognition that in competition between nations, moral considerations often yield to strategic necessity. The United States and Soviet Union both made the same calculation. These men knew things worth knowing, and that knowledge was more valuable than accountability for what they had done to acquire it. The rockets they built would carry satellites that revolutionized communication, weather forecasting, and navigation. They would carry humans beyond Earth. They would expand our understanding of the universe. But they began as weapons built by slave labor, designed to kill. That origin cannot be erased, no matter how far the rockets flew. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.